The hospital had grown quiet as the night shift settled in. Hallways that were bustling during the day were now dim and almost empty. Nurses walked with measured steps. Doctors moved quickly between patient rooms and machines beeped rhythmically in the background. One nurse, a young black woman in her mid-20s, had just finished her last round of checking on patients. She was exhausted, but the satisfaction of completing her shift kept her moving. She loved her job not for the praise or recognition, but for the small moments when she could comfort someone, calm a worried family member, or save a life. Her shift had been particularly challenging that night. 2 critical patients required constant monitoring, and another had fallen in the hallway earlier, causing a moment of chaos. She had stayed calm, juggling the needs of multiple patients while coordinating with doctors and fellow nurses. It was draining work, but she thrived in these moments. She understood that every small action mattered. Even now, as she made her way to the staff exit, she kept her posture straight, her mind focused, and her spirit steady. Outside, the parking lot was almost empty. The night air was cool, carrying the faint smell of wet asphalt from the earlier rain. Streetlights cast long shadows, and the occasional sound of a distant car or ambulance broke the silence. She walked with purpose, her bag slung over her shoulder, keys in hand, ready to head home. She had plans to rest, to eat something, and maybe call her father for a quick chat before bed. He was a Delta Force commander, a man she admired deeply. His career had always been inspiring, but tonight she simply wanted to relax, not think about missions or military discipline. As she reached her car, she noticed a police vehicle parked nearby. The engine was off, but the officer inside seemed to be watching her. She kept walking, assuming he was just parked there like any other officer on duty. But as she approached, the officer stepped out, blocking her path. His posture was firm, and the way he looked at her made her pause. She instinctively reached for her bag, not out of fear, but out of caution, understanding that the night could become unpredictable very quickly. "Good evening, ma'am," he said, his tone flat but carrying an edge that immediately put her on alert. "Where are you coming from?" She stopped, keeping her hands visible, and replied calmly, "I'm leaving work. I just finished my shift at the hospital." The officer raised an eyebrow and leaned slightly closer. "Which hospital?" he asked. His voice had a sharpness that hinted he wasn't asking casually. She answered politely, stating the hospital's name and her department. She noticed his eyes scanning her ID badge as she held it out. "I'm a nurse in the ICU," she added, trying to keep the tone friendly yet firm. She had faced rude comments before, but something about this officer made her wary. He stepped back slightly, but his gaze never left her. "You live around here?" he asked. His question didn't seem innocent. It carried suspicion, a subtle assumption that something about her presence was unusual. "Yes, I live a few blocks away," she replied evenly. She kept her voice steady, careful not to escalate the situation. She had learned over the years that staying composed was often the best defense. The officer chuckled lightly, a sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Working late, huh? Must be tough on someone like you." His words carried an undertone that made her stiffen. Someone like her? She had a feeling she knew exactly what he meant, but she chose to ignore the bait. She continued, "Yes, the shifts can be long, but I enjoy helping people. That's why I became a nurse." Her words were calm, but her heart began to beat faster. She sensed the tension rising, a silent battle forming in the quiet night. The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he circled around her slowly, taking in every detail. She noticed his colleagues in another vehicle, watching from a distance. None of them intervened, which made her realize she was on her own in this moment. She remained composed, aware that any sudden movement could be misinterpreted. "You don't look like you belong in this area," he said finally. His words were deliberate, meant to unsettle her. The implication was clear, and though her mind raced with anger and disbelief, she forced herself to remain calm. She had faced prejudice before, but being questioned in this manner after a long shift felt especially unfair. "I work here," she said simply, letting the facts speak for themselves. "I've been here all night taking care of patients. You can check with the hospital if you need verification." She kept her tone polite but firm, signaling that she would not be intimidated. The officer stepped even closer, his presence looming. "You're awfully confident for someone who's just a nurse," he said. The comment stung, though she didn't show it. She had trained herself to respond with composure, knowing that losing control could make the situation worse. I'm confident because I know my work and I know my responsibilities, she replied. Her voice remained steady, but inside a mixture of frustration and caution stirred. She had to navigate this carefully. She could sense the officer's intent, to provoke, to assert dominance, and she was determined not to give him the satisfaction. He squinted at her, as if sizing her up. Do you always walk around here at night by yourself? He asked. The question was unnecessary and intrusive, but she answered calmly. I do sometimes, yes. I live nearby and I trust my surroundings. I'm careful, like anyone should be at night. He made a sound, half laugh, half snort, that made her feel a wave of irritation. You sure about that? He asked. People like you can get into trouble. His words were thinly veiled threats meant to unsettle her confidence. She remained silent for a moment, choosing her next words carefully. I appreciate your concern, officer, but I know how to take care of myself. I've had a long shift and I just want to get home safely. Her words were calm, yet her mind raced. She knew that in moments like this, staying composed was her best strategy. The officer tilted his head, studying her expression. There was a mix of defiance and calm that he hadn't expected. He could see that she was not afraid, at least not in a way that he could exploit. That realization seemed to irritate him further, though he didn't admit it. Can I see your ID again? He asked, his tone a little sharper this time. She handed it to him without hesitation, understanding that any sudden refusal could escalate the situation. She watched closely as he inspected it, noting the way he scanned the badge, the printed name, and her photo. You've got a long night, he said finally, handing back her ID. His tone suggested he was done for now, but she knew better. Situations like this rarely ended without lingering tension. She took a deep breath, reminding herself to stay focused and calm. Thank you, she said softly. Ready to move past the encounter, she started walking toward her car, keys in hand, ready to leave the tension behind. But she remained vigilant. She knew that even after the officer returned to his vehicle, the air of suspicion and the subtle message of intimidation lingered. As she reached her car, she paused for a moment. The night was silent again, the city lights casting a soft glow on the wet pavement. She reflected on the encounter, realizing how easily prejudice could surface in unexpected places. She was tired, but she was also determined not to let fear or anger dictate her actions. She had trained herself to respond with dignity, and she would continue to do so. Sliding into the driver's seat, she took a moment to collect herself. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, not out of fear, but to steady the adrenaline that had risen during the encounter. She started the engine, her mind replaying the interaction, noting details that might be important later. She was aware that sometimes keeping a record of these moments was necessary. It wasn't just about personal safety. It was about accountability and truth. Driving away from the hospital, she reflected on her work, her life, and her resilience. She had chosen a path dedicated to helping others, and moments like this were tests of character. She knew that she could face prejudice, intimidation, and even danger, but her commitment to her values would remain strong. The night had been long, the challenge unexpected, but she felt a quiet pride in how she had handled herself. As the city lights blurred past her window, she made a mental note to call her father. Not out of fear, but to share the experience and get advice. She knew he would appreciate her composure, but he would also want to ensure her safety. His guidance had always been a source of strength, and tonight would be no different. The night continued quiet and dark, yet full of unspoken tension. She drove steadily, aware of her surroundings, her mind clear and alert. She knew that the encounter with the officer was just one moment in a long night, but it was a moment that reminded her of the challenges she faced and the strength she carried within herself. She parked outside her apartment complex, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment, taking a deep breath. The city felt distant, the tension beginning to fade. She knew that what had happened at the hospital parking lot would stay with her, but she also knew that she was not powerless. She had faced it with grace, intelligence, and strength. Her phone buzzed with a message from a colleague checking in. She smiled softly, replying with a few words of reassurance. Even in a world that sometimes seemed unfair and intimidating, she had allies, she had knowledge, and she had herself. That realization gave her a quiet sense of victory, a reminder that courage was not always loud. It was steady, Callie. The next night, she returned to work, trying to shake off the memory of the previous encounter. The hospital was busy again, though not overwhelmingly so. She felt a mixture of focus and exhaustion as she prepared for her shift. Nursing had always been demanding, but nights like this tested patience and resolve in ways that went beyond fatigue. She reminded herself to stay alert, not just for her patients but for herself as well. As she made her rounds, the usual rhythm of the hospital helped her settle. Machines beeped steadily. Conversations between nurses and patients filled the air, and the scent of antiseptic was familiar, almost comforting. She liked the routine. It grounded her, gave her a sense of control even in moments that felt chaotic. She knew her patients depended on her calm, her expertise, and her ability to handle whatever came her way. During her shift, she noticed a few familiar faces among the night staff, but her focus remained sharp. She checked charts, administered medications, and responded to alarms with practiced efficiency. Even in the midst of the workload, her mind occasionally wandered to the parking lot encounter from the night before. She replayed the details. The officer's stance, the words he had used, the look in his eyes. She felt the frustration rise again, but she reminded herself to channel it into caution rather than anger. By the time her shift was winding down, she felt a familiar relief mixed with exhaustion. Nights like these left her drained, but she also felt the quiet satisfaction of a job well done. She gathered her things, double-checked her patients, and prepared to leave. Outside, the night was cool and still, with the occasional distant sound of traffic breaking the silence. She walked toward her car, keys in hand, aware of every shadow and movement around her. As she reached her car, a police vehicle pulled up beside her. It was the same officer from the previous night. Her stomach sank slightly, but she straightened her shoulders and kept her pace steady. She didn't want to show fear, though she felt the tension rising naturally. The officer stepped out again, his expression unreadable, though she could sense a subtle challenge in his eyes. "Evening," he said, his tone flat, almost dismissive. "You're working late again?" "Yes," she replied calmly, holding her head high. "It's been a long shift, but I'm almost done." She kept her voice neutral, careful not to provoke. He circled her slowly, eyes scanning her like before. "You sure you're in the right area? Seems unusual for someone like you to be here at this hour," he said, repeating the insinuation that had bothered her so much the previous night. She recognized the tactic, an attempt to unsettle and intimidate. She refused to give him the satisfaction. "I work at the hospital. I've been here all night," she said evenly. "You can check with the staff if you need confirmation." Her tone was firm but not confrontational, a shield against the subtle aggression directed at her. The officer leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice. "You know, it's not always safe for someone like you to be alone at night," he said. His words were intended to provoke doubt and fear. She felt a wave of irritation but kept her expression calm. She had faced prejudice in many forms, but this persistence was exhausting. "I'm aware of my surroundings and I take precautions," she said softly but firmly. "I know how to keep myself safe. Thank you for your concern." She held his gaze, not with challenge but with a quiet confidence that she hoped would signal her strength. He paused for a moment as if reconsidering his approach. Then he smirked slightly, a look that didn't reach his eyes. "You're awfully confident for someone who's just a nurse," he said, repeating the jab from the previous night. It was meant to belittle her, to imply that she didn't belong in a position of knowledge or authority. "I'm confident because I know my responsibilities and my abilities," she replied evenly. "My work requires focus, skill, and calm under pressure. That's why I do my job well." Her words were steady, carrying the weight of experience and self-assurance. He circled her again, glancing at her ID badge, the hospital, and the parking lot. She noticed his colleagues nearby, watching silently. None of them intervened, leaving her to navigate the situation on her own. Her mind raced, considering her options. She wanted to leave, to avoid escalation. But she also knew she couldn't ignore the harassment. This was not a simple misunderstanding. It was deliberate, and it needed to be addressed. She reached into her bag and subtly started recording the encounter with her phone. Not to escalate further, but to ensure there was a record if needed. The officer noticed the movement and furrowed his brow. "What are you doing?" he asked, suspicion rising in his tone. "Documenting for safety," she said quietly. "I want to make sure everything here is clear and above board." Her words were calm, but they carried an unspoken warning. She wasn't afraid to protect herself and her rights. The officer stepped back slightly, though his eyes remained fixed on her. He could sense that she was not a typical person to intimidate. There was a quiet strength in the way she held herself, a subtle authority that didn't come from rank or uniform, but from confidence and self-assurance. It made him uneasy, though he tried not to show it. At that moment, her mind went to her father. She hadn't mentioned him before, but he had trained her to handle high-pressure situations with calm, decisive action. She thought about calling him not in panic, but to inform him of the harassment and to seek guidance. Her father was a Delta Force commander, a man of immense experience and authority. His presence, even over the phone, could shift the dynamics of the situation. She reached for her phone discreetly, dialing her father while keeping her eyes on the officer. Her voice was calm as she explained that she needed to talk, briefly mentioning that she was dealing with a tense situation outside the hospital. She spoke in measured tones, describing the officer's behavior, the questions, and the subtle threats. She didn't exaggerate. She simply stated the facts, trusting her father to respond with the clarity and decisiveness she knew he possessed. Her father listened carefully, his tone steady but commanding. He asked questions about her surroundings, the officer's demeanor, and any other people present. She answered calmly, noting details that seemed insignificant but could matter later. Within minutes, her father had already begun taking action, using his contacts to ensure that the situation would be handled responsibly and fairly. Meanwhile, the officer began to notice something different in her demeanor. She was no longer just a nurse. She was someone who carried authority, intelligence, and awareness that went far beyond what he had expected. There was a subtle confidence in her movements, a controlled focus that hinted she was capable of far more than he had assumed. His attempts to intimidate her were losing their effect. Her colleagues inside the hospital noticed her distress and started inquiring about the situation. One nurse approached the exit, asking if she was okay. She reassured them with a small nod, signaling that she had it under control. She didn't want to escalate panic, but she also didn't want to appear vulnerable. This was a delicate balance, and she managed it with the quiet grace that had defined her throughout her career. As she spoke briefly into the phone, her father instructed her to stay calm, to document everything, and to avoid any confrontation that could put her at risk. She followed his guidance precisely, keeping her movements measured and her voice steady. She realized the power of preparation, of having a plan and knowing how to execute it, even in situations designed to provoke fear. The officer seemed to sense that the dynamic had shifted. His confident stance wavered slightly, though he tried to maintain authority. She continued to record details discreetly, noting his words, gestures, and the presence of his colleagues. She was careful, but deliberate, ensuring that there was a clear record of what had occurred. Her father asked her to note the make and model of the police vehicle, the officer's badge number, and the approximate time of the encounter. She did so without hesitation, feeling a sense of control returning. She understood that knowledge and preparation were her strongest tools in situations where intimidation and prejudice were at play. As the minutes passed, the officer's behavior became less aggressive. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but she could feel the change. He seemed to realize that his assumptions about her had been incorrect, that his attempts to unsettle her were failing. There was a tension in the air, a silent acknowledgement that the balance of power had shifted, even if he couldn't articulate it. She kept speaking softly into the phone, updating her father on every change in behavior. He instructed her to remain calm, to prepare for any outcome, and to trust her instincts. She felt reassured knowing that she was not alone. Even though physically she stood alone in the parking lot, she had the guidance and support of someone experienced in handling complex and tense situations. By the time her father concluded the call, the officer had stepped back further, his stance less threatening. He seemed unsure, as if realizing that the situation was no longer under his control. She felt a quiet sense of relief but remained vigilant, knowing that the night was not yet over and that awareness was her greatest ally. She finally got into her car, started the engine, and took a deep breath. The tension that had gripped her moments before began to ease slightly. She knew she had handled the encounter with composure and intelligence. Her father's guidance. The following night felt heavier, as if the air itself carried the memory of the previous encounters. She arrived at the hospital, her uniform neat, her posture straight, her mind already bracing for the long hours ahead. Nights were often quieter than days, but she knew they brought their own challenges. Emergencies came without warning, and moments of tension could arise out of nowhere. Tonight, however, there was a shadow lingering in her thoughts, a reminder of the police officer who had harassed her in the parking lot. She focused on her patients first, checking vital signs, administering medications, and documenting each step carefully. The hospital had its rhythm, and she relied on it to keep her grounded. Each beep from a monitor, each whispered conversation in a hallway, reminded her that she was needed here, that her work mattered. Yet between these duties, her mind drifted to the officer. She could not forget the way he had spoken, the insinuation in his tone, or the subtle attempts to intimidate her. By the time her shift was winding down, her exhaustion mingled with an unshakable tension. She moved efficiently, finishing patient checks and logging the last notes for the night. The hallway lights reflected off the polished floors, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly. She gathered her belongings and stepped toward the exit, keys in hand, aware of the quiet world outside. As she reached the parking lot, she noticed the same police vehicle again. Her heart sank slightly, but she steadied herself, walking with purposeful calm. The officer emerged once more, flanked by 2 colleagues this time. Their presence added a weight to the situation, an implicit attempt at intimidation. She had to remain composed to avoid giving them any reason to escalate further. "Evening again," the officer said, his tone carrying the same edge as before. "Looks like you're working late a lot these days." "Yes," she replied calmly, keeping her voice even. "The hospital needs care 24 hours a day. I do my job as best I can." Her tone was firm but not confrontational. She had learned that professionalism often diffused unnecessary tension. The officer's eyes narrowed. "People don't usually see someone like you walking around here at this hour. It's unusual." The words were designed to unsettle, to make her doubt herself. She felt a surge of frustration but did not let it show. Instead, she drew a deep breath and focused on her next steps. She reached for her phone, subtly ready to call her father if needed. Her father, a Delta Force commander, had always taught her the importance of strategic thinking in tense situations. She knew this was not just about safety. It was about asserting calm, dignity, and awareness. Her father had prepared her to face challenges with clarity, and now those lessons were coming to life. Before she could dial, one of the officer's colleagues spoke up, clearly questioning her presence. "What's your business here?" he asked, his voice carrying suspicion. "I work at the hospital," she replied firmly. "I just finished my shift and I'm heading home. You can verify this if needed." Her words were precise, clear, leaving no room for misinterpretation. She kept her hands visible, aware that any sudden movement could be misconstrued. The officer stepped closer, leaning slightly toward her, his posture aggressive but calculated. "You sure about that?" "Seems off," he said, his tone implying disbelief. She could see the challenge in his eyes, the subtle power play he was attempting, but she held herself steady, refusing to rise to provocation. Finally, she spoke calmly. "I've been here all night. I've taken care of patients, documented everything, and followed all protocols. My work speaks for itself." Her words were even, carrying a quiet authority that she hoped would signal that she was not easily intimidated. At that moment, she decided it was time to take decisive action. She pulled her phone from her pocket, unlocking it and dialing her father. She spoke clearly, calmly, and briefly explained the situation. Her voice was measured, recounting the officer's behavior and the presence of his colleagues. She didn't exaggerate. She simply reported the facts, trusting her father to respond with the expertise and authority he always demonstrated. Her father listened intently, asking about the officer's mannerisms, the vehicles present, and any witnesses nearby. She provided each detail carefully, understanding that the small observations could matter greatly. He gave instructions in his usual calm, commanding manner. "Stay composed. Document everything. Avoid confrontation. I'll handle this through the right channels. You're not alone." Hearing his voice gave her an immediate sense of control. She felt the tension ease slightly, replaced by a focused determination. She began recording the encounter discreetly, noting the officer's words and gestures. Every small action and remark was carefully documented. She knew that evidence, precision, and composure were her strongest tools. The officers noticed the subtle shift. She was no longer just a nurse. They realized she had awareness, preparation, and a presence that they had not anticipated. The confidence in her movements, the calm clarity in her voice, and the subtle authority she carried began to unsettle them. Their attempts at intimidation were losing effect. One officer's smirk faltered slightly, another's gaze wavered. She remained calm, speaking softly into the phone as her father guided her. "Update me," he said. "Every change matters." She complied, keeping her words precise, her tone steady. She felt a quiet strength in her ability to remain in control while the officers began to doubt themselves. Meanwhile, inside the hospital, her colleagues had noticed her delay and the unusual tension. One nurse approached the exit asking if she was okay. She reassured them with a nod, explaining that everything was under control. Her presence of mind helped prevent unnecessary worry, but she remained alert. The officer's subtle aggression was still present, and she could not afford to be complacent. Minutes passed, each stretching longer than the last. She continued speaking to her father, following his instructions exactly. "Take note of the badge numbers," he said. "Observe the vehicle models. Keep a mental timeline. Record everything discreetly." She did so, aware that precision and clarity could make all the difference. The officer's demeanor continued to change. They were no longer confident. Uncertainty crept into their postures and expressions. She could see the realization dawning. They had underestimated her. She held herself steady, letting her calm confidence speak louder than any words. Her father's instructions were clear and methodical. He emphasized staying composed, using documentation, and maintaining situational awareness. She followed each directive with care, knowing that her own actions were now part of a larger strategy to address harassment responsibly. At one point, one officer stepped back, muttering something under his breath. She did not react, simply observing and continuing to record details. Her father reminded her to stay quiet but vigilant, to keep track of every small movement and word. She complied, knowing that patience and precision were essential. The tension in the parking lot began to shift. The officers were visibly unsure now, their initial confidence eroded by her composure and the unseen presence of her father's authority. They could sense that they were no longer in control, that the situation had changed in subtle but unmistakable ways. She felt a quiet satisfaction, not from triumph over them, but from her own clarity and calm. She had managed to navigate a situation designed to intimidate, using only awareness, composure, and careful action. Her training, both professional and personal, was paying off in real time. After several minutes, the officers started to retreat slightly, their questions and comments less sharp. She remained alert, continuing to document the encounter and communicate with her father. His guidance provided reassurance and a sense of strategy. She understood that the situation was far from over, but the power dynamics had shifted in her favor. Finally, she reached her car, unlocking it with steady hands. She paused for a moment, keeping her eyes on the officers while putting her belongings inside. She started the engine and took a deep breath. The immediate tension had eased, but she remained cautious, aware that vigilance was still necessary. Driving away from the hospital, she reflected on the night's events. She had faced harassment directly and had responded with calm intelligence and preparation. Her father's guidance had been crucial, but her own composure had determined the outcome. She realized the importance of staying centered, of documenting and observing, and of taking strategic action rather than reacting impulsively. By the time she reached home, the encounter felt like both a challenge and a lesson. She parked, turned off the engine, and sat quietly, letting the adrenaline subside. She had faced prejudice and intimidation, yet she had maintained control, dignity, and safety. Inside her apartment, she prepared to rest, but her mind remained alert, reviewing the details of the encounter. She knew her father would take the necessary actions to address the officer's behavior, but she also recognized the personal growth she had gained. She had learned the power of calm, documentation, and strategic thinking. She called her father one more time, summarizing the night and expressing gratitude for his guidance. His voice was steady and reassuring. "You handled this perfectly," he said. "You stayed calm, observed everything, and kept yourself safe. That's what matters." She felt a wave of relief and pride. The night had tested her, but she had passed with dignity and intelligence as she settled into her app. The next night, the tension in the hospital parking lot was palpable before she even arrived. She had prepared herself mentally, knowing that what had happened before might repeat. But this time she had an added layer of support. Her father was actively involved, coordinating with local authorities through his contacts. She drove steadily, aware of her surroundings, noticing the quiet of the city streets and the way the streetlights cast long, flickering shadows. Each step she took toward the hospital entrance felt purposeful, her mind focused on both her patients and her own safety. Her shift began with routine care, but she stayed alert. Something in the air felt different. There was a sense of anticipation she couldn't shake. She moved efficiently, checking vital signs, recording details, and responding to alarms. Even as she attended to patients, she remained aware of the time and the inevitable encounter awaiting her after the shift. She had learned to compartmentalize, focus on work first, handle the tension later. Nursing had trained her to maintain calm in moments of crisis, and now that skill was invaluable outside the hospital walls. By the time her shift was nearing its end, the parking lot loomed in her thoughts. She gathered her things, double-checking her bag, her ID, and her phone. Her father had instructed her to keep her phone ready and her recording discreet just in case. He had made arrangements through his military contacts to ensure that the officers involved would face consequences if harassment continued. She felt a mix of reassurance and determination. This wasn't about intimidation anymore. It was about accountability and fairness. As she stepped into the lot, she saw the officer waiting again, this time alone. There was a stiff, almost defensive posture to him that wasn't there before. He seemed aware that the dynamics had changed, though he didn't yet understand why. She approached calmly, her keys in hand, ready for the encounter but not anticipating escalation. "Evening," he said, a little less confident than before. "You're back late again." His words were flat, lacking the subtle menace of previous nights. "Yes," she replied evenly. "It's the end of my shift. I've completed my rounds and patient checks." Her voice was calm, measured, carrying the quiet authority that had grown stronger over the past encounters. The officer's eyes flickered as he noticed her phone in hand, a hint of hesitation in his stance. "Recording again?" he asked, the question laced with unease. "Yes," she said simply. "For safety and documentation." Her tone was polite but firm. She wasn't looking to provoke, only to ensure that there was a clear record of the interaction. The officer's posture shifted slightly. There was an uncertainty there now, a crack in the facade he had maintained. He had expected compliance, fear, maybe even confusion. Instead, he saw composure, preparation, and quiet confidence. His training as a law enforcement officer didn't prepare him for someone who would stand calmly, fully aware and completely in control of the situation. She spoke briefly into her phone, updating her father on the encounter. Her words were concise, noting his tone, posture, and the environment. Her father's voice came through softly but firmly. "Stay calm. Keep documenting. I am on the way. Do not engage beyond what is necessary. He will be held accountable." His instructions were precise, and they gave her a renewed sense of assurance. Minutes passed, stretching slowly. As the officer shifted uneasily, she remained calm, keeping her phone discreetly recording, her eyes attentive, her body language open yet controlled. The night seemed to stretch around them, quiet except for the distant hum of the city. She was aware that the officer was trying to assess the situation, to find a point of leverage, but none existed. Then, headlights appeared in the distance, moving steadily toward the parking lot. She noticed immediately that it wasn't just any vehicle. It was one that carried authority and a presence that demanded attention. Her father had arrived, not in uniform, but his stature, posture, and demeanor conveyed a weight that the officer instantly recognized. The officer's smirk faltered. He stepped back slightly as if suddenly unsure of the power dynamics at play. The moment was quiet, almost surreal, as the Delta Force commander approached. There was no aggression, no threat in his walk, only calm authority. The presence of someone who carried such experience and influence transformed the atmosphere instantly. Her father's gaze swept the scene, noting the officer, his vehicle, and the nurse. His voice was calm but commanding. "I understand there has been harassment," he said, addressing the officer directly. "We need to resolve this professionally and respectfully." The officer, caught off guard, struggled to find words. He had expected to intimidate, to assert control over a nurse, but he now faced someone who carried authority far beyond his own, someone who would not tolerate misconduct. The shift in the dynamic was immediate. The nurse watched quietly, pride swelling subtly, knowing that her father's presence was ensuring the situation would be handled with both authority and professionalism. She had faced intimidation directly, remained calm, and now, support had arrived, not as a show of force, but as a firm reminder of accountability and consequences. Her father continued, addressing the situation with a calm precision. Harassment and racial profiling are unacceptable. I am here to ensure this is handled appropriately. Everyone involved will be held accountable according to the law and protocol. His words carried weight, not just because of his position, but because of the clarity and authority in his tone. The officer's colleagues, observing from a distance, began to understand the seriousness of the moment. The casual arrogance they had assumed was gone, replaced with a cautious awareness that this was no longer a routine encounter. The weight of authority, combined with calm and precise communication, had transformed the interaction completely. Her father turned to the nurse briefly, nodding subtly. She understood the message. Stay calm, observe, and trust the process. She remained composed, knowing that her prior preparation, her documentation, and her calm had already shifted the balance in her favor. The officer, now visibly uneasy, attempted a weak explanation, but it faltered under her father's steady gaze. There was no room for deflection or minimization. Every word he had used, every assumption he had made was now being addressed with authority and clarity. Her father spoke again, his voice measured. You are here to serve and protect, which includes respecting the rights and dignity of every individual. Failure to do so will result in appropriate disciplinary action. Do you understand? The officer swallowed, his previous confidence replaced by uncertainty. He nodded quickly, unable to argue or resist the truth of the statement. The presence of the Delta Force commander, combined with the nurse's calm documentation and composed demeanor, had left him with no avenue to assert dominance or minimize his behavior. The nurse felt a quiet satisfaction, not from the embarrassment of the officer, but from the justice and clarity of the situation. She had remained composed, strategic, and precise, and the consequences of harassment were now undeniable. The lesson being imparted was firm yet professional, assertion without aggression, authority without intimidation. Her father spoke to the officer about procedure, respect, and the importance of professionalism. His words were firm, clear, and unyielding, yet there was no anger in them, only a steady commitment to fairness and accountability. The officer could sense the weight of experience, the understanding that this was not personal retribution, but the enforcement of standards and respect. After several minutes, the situation began to de-escalate. The officer and his colleagues were formally reminded of their responsibilities and the consequences of misconduct. The nurse, while relieved, remained observant, ensuring that every word, gesture, and action was noted for accuracy. She had learned the importance of awareness, precision, and calm, and it continued to guide her through the remainder of the encounter. Her father spoke briefly to the hospital administration, explaining the situation and ensuring that proper reports would be filed. He emphasized fairness, accountability, and the need to maintain respect for all parties involved. The hospital staff observed the interaction, impressed by the calm authority and strategic handling of what could have escalated into conflict. Finally, her father turned to the nurse, giving a subtle nod of approval. She felt a deep sense of pride, not just in the outcome but in her own actions. She had maintained composure under repeated intimidation, documented everything carefully, and followed instructions with clarity and discipline. Her presence of mind, combined with her father's support, had ensured a just resolution. As the officers departed, the tension in the parking lot began to fade. The nurse watched them leave, noting their subdued demeanor, a clear contrast to the earlier arrogance. The lesson had been delivered without aggression, yet the message was unmistakable. Harassment and prejudice would not be tolerated. The nurse and her father walked toward her car. He spoke briefly, reinforcing the importance of dignity, composure, and strategy. She listened, absorbing the guidance, understanding that the strength she displayed was both innate and cultivated. She had faced intimidation head-on and emerged with confidence, clarity, and respect intact. Driving home, she reflected on the night. The experience had been challenging yet empowering. She had learned the value of preparation, calm, and strategic action. She had also witnessed